everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And today I'm joined by writer D Johnston to talk all about his book, for people watching the video, Disneyland. Hello, D.
Hi there, thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I can't wait to talk to you about it because I really enjoyed the book. How do you describe Disneyland to people when they ask what it's about?
It's a really happy story about the end of the world. It's
right.
it's putting the fun back into the apocalypse. You know, it's had a bad rap recently, and this is it's meant to. There's some bleak times in it, but it's meant to be uplifting.
And yeah, and it ultimately is. So when did you start to write it, and did it change as the world changed? Because as you say, it's got a kind of apocalyptic tone to it, but in the last few years, that's been a bit too close to the bone, maybe for comfort.
It has been. It was about a decade ago that I realised that there was something strange in our culture where we seem to be overwhelmed with novels and films and what have you all about the end of the world. And I thought if there's some future civilization looks back at our time, then what they'll find hard to fathom is that we so relentlessly predicted the collapse of our civilization and yet did so little about it. And I knew that I wanted to do something about that. And I was just stuck for years and years. And it was at the turning point was in it was February 2020, and me and my then partner, we were down on a train. This was down in the south of England, and she was pregnant at the time, and there was nowhere to sit. And I looked down the carriage, and everybody was oblivious. You know, they were all on their phones. And it was the weekend of Storm Dennis, and the land was still flooded for Storm Kira. It was like the wettest February on record and all this. And we're on this train and everyone's on their phones and it just seemed miserable. And there was all the robot voice warning us, you know, something doesn't look right, and the CCTV. And I thought, this is how 20th century science fiction writers, this is how they imagined a future dystopia.
Yeah.
And I thought that the story I was going to write wasn't going to be about how we might fall into a dystopia. It was going to be about how we might get out of the dystopia we're in.
It's interesting you talking about kind of science fiction. I hadn't really thought of it as science fiction as such, but it's interesting how that world has changed from kind of post-war being quite a kind of positive thing, that the future's going to be, you know, something quite positive and helpful, to being the absolute opposite of that. And I suppose Disneyland kind of shows you the aftermath of that situation.
It is. I mean, I think that there's very little optimistic science fiction out there, and what there is, you know, maybe some of the Ian M. Banks stuff. You'll know a great deal more about that than I do, or Kim Stanley Robinson or something. You know, they maybe find high technology solutions for the future.
Yeah.
And I didn't even drive. I'm a bit of a Luddite in that way. So I don't. Those they can seem quite dystopian to me as well. And Disneyland's more about, well, do we have to keep going the direction we're going, or can we stop?
Yeah, or are we made to stop?
Are we made to stop? Right?
Yeah, because we shouldn't make make people think that it's kind of sci-fi. It's very relatable. It's very much set in, well, this world, but another world as well. Maybe you should talk a little bit about the kind of what influenced Disneyland in terms of other books. Were there things that you thought, yeah, I'd like to kind of do something similar to this?
There probably, I mean, there are a few you know, interesting post-apocalyptic books out there, but an awful lot of them tend to follow a formula where, broadly speaking, the telly goes off and, you know, the next minute everyone turns to cannibalism. It's quite a bleak outlook, and that's a message that goes through our literary culture in all sorts of ways. You know, you think about books like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or Lord of the Flies. It's messages that there's a beast inside us all, and in the absence of authority, we're going to turn to a state of savagery. It's essentially a sort of the ideas of Thomas Hobbes. And there are a few, you know, in Scotland, I think Jenny Fagan's The Sunlight Pilgrims. That's a you know, interesting book. Ewan Morrison did a book names off time, but last year that is a, you know, again, quite an interesting response to the end of the world. I think
was that the How to Survive?
That's the one.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely, yeah. Again, interestingly enough, I read it and thought this is about COVID and stuff, but he'd started. It's amazing how many books that, a bit like your own, you think, oh, this is a direct relation to the last few years, and it really isn't. It started long before that.
So Emily St John Mandle's Station 11. That's another one where, you know, it's bleak, but there's also a lot of tenderness and humanity as well. And that's one of the things about you mentioned COVID there. During that first lockdown, you know, we were all outside on our Thursday nights and singing together. Our neighbours, we didn't really talk to each other very much, not normally, but suddenly we were all checking in on each other, and that was the experience around the world, really. And that encouraged me to think, well, let's make this book about how people can pull together in times of adversity, about cooperation and mutual aid, rather than the popular perception of what will happen when there's a disaster, which is that we'll sink into a state of individualistic savagery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the structure. It's an interesting one. At the beginning, there's a kind of realist opening, and then you talk about hearing the voice for the first time. So what, and I think you even talk about the novel itself, you describe it at the end as a prophecy, you know, that kind of thing. So tell us a little bit about those aspects, what you wanted to do there.
So that started with, as I say, I've been struggling with this book for a long time, and we had a wee boy. He was born in June 2020, just at the end of lockdown, and it was a stressful time. And anybody who's got parents knows like what those first weeks are like. It's exhausting. And his mum, it was a really difficult labour, and she was recovering, and I was trying to look after this wee boy, and I was just exhausted. And I started hallucinating, just with I'd think that I'd fallen asleep holding him. I'd wake up in a panic. And there was one time that I carried him round the bed, and I went to put him in his wee basket, and as only as I lowered him down, I seen he was already in his basket, and there was nothing in my arms at all. And at the same time, I started trying to write the book, and it was just there, like it was a voice in my head. It just came up. So it was sort of that, and I was really interested in religious ideas about the apocalypse. I got interested a while back in these millenarian sort of Reformation era radical Christians, guys like Thomas Müntzer and Jan Matthys, and they believed that there was going to be this great reckoning when all the evildoers would be smited. And I find that a very comforting thought. I'm not against that idea. And I wanted that to come through in the book as well. And I started to notice that there were all these wee synergies, just like the fact that a newborn baby's basket is called a Moses basket. Mm-hmm. And I started to sort of play around with that a bit, and experience of having a child. It's such a sort of it's hard not to sound a wee bit daft saying this, but it's such a profound spiritual sort of thing. And it just came out that way.
And the idea kind of, because it takes us into another world, but it's very much a recognizable world. Yeah. And, you know, the idea of kind of the multiverse or anything like that, you know, is now very big in popular culture. But the idea of possible world theory, that kind of philosophical idea, has been around for a long time. And was that something that you thought, yeah, in another world, this could be the life that's being lived?
So I think I didn't want to sort of propose that this was a vision of what would actually happen, because I didn't think that we were going to reach this sort of societal collapse in 2 years' time, and I didn't want to set it far in the future because I've not got that technological imagination. So seeing, well, this is a similar but different reality was a device in that way. But it's also something about I think about my distance from Scotland, right. That my Scotland's very different from contemporary Scotland. I've been away, more than 2 decades now. I've now spent, I think I've just reached a point where I've spent more of my life away from Scotland than there. So a lot of sort of my idea of Scotland, it actually comes for 20 years ago and longer. So it was always going to be somewhere that was a wee bit like Scotland, but also quite different.
Well, let's talk about place, because place plays a big part in it. And the Scottish town is Dundule. Tell us a little bit about that, because again, it'll be recognisable, but something different.
So I wrote, when I wrote my first novel, and I started working on that, 15 years ago or something, and that's set in Dundule. And it's, so long ago, it's hard to mind why I thought a fictional location, but there's a real tradition of that in Scottish fiction, isn't there? Like, when one of the first sort of proper books I read is when I was at school, and we had to write a book review. We got to go into the school library, choose a book, and write a book review. And just sort of random, I pulled out a collection of William McIlvanney stories. It blew my mind. I'd never seen anything like that. The Walking Wounded, it was called.
Oh, that's one of my favourites as well. I read that at a young age, and it absolutely changed me. Yeah,
it's amazing. So many books I've read, and my memory is terrible. And I go, I can't remember what happened in that. And that's I think kind of like 35 years ago or something I read it, and it's still there. And of course he wrote in Graithnock, but Lewis Grassic Gaben, he had he invented was it Duncairn in the latter part of Scott Square. And interestingly, people thought that was Dundee, and a lot of people think Dundule's Dundee because it sounds a wee bit like that, but it's just Dun for fort and Dule, an old word for sorrow. That's where I got the name for it, and it's meant to be somewhere sort of west Lothian-ish central belt.
Does Grangemouth get a mention at one point?
Aye, it does. So it's around about there. It's somewhere near sort of Bathgate. There's a wee patch where I could almost imagine, if you were applying, you think, you could knock something up there. But that was sort of why I have a fictional location. The other thing is that most of my life in Scotland, certainly, I lived in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is a wonderful city to write about, but it's a city of Jekyll and Hyde. There's this defining thing of Edinburgh. You had Liam McIlvanney on a wee while back, and he was talking about Glasgow and how Glasgow's got this duality to him. And he's saying, it goes back to Defoe, and that was really interesting because I think that's my opinion of Edinburgh even more so. It's the new town and it's the old town, and most of its literature is defined by that sort of duality. And sometime maybe I'd love to explore that, but that wasn't sort of suiting my purposes at that time. So Dundule came about, and it's nice having a fictional location because if you suddenly think, I need there to be a steam train. Well, what do you know? There's a steam train.
But it reminded me a way of what Alistair Gray does with Glasgow and Unthanking, that you've got something which you think you could probably go and walk around the streets of it, but there's enough difference to make it something fresh and new.
Aye, that's what I'd hope, that it's just a wee bit uncanny, you know, it's just slightly off.
And you were saying it's a dystopian novel, but one which really does offer hope. Was it enjoyable to write about the end of the world, or kind of near the end of the world?
Well, I think like in my more despairing moments, as I say, there's something that that idea of a cataclysmic rupture is. I understand why throughout history oppressed peoples have found that faith alluring, you know, that all this can be wiped away, and we can build something new, and there's echoes of that right through to recent revolutionary movements. You know, a famous quote from the Spanish anarchist Buenaventura Durruti, that the bourgeois may blast and ruin its world before it leaves the stage of history forever, but there's a new world growing in our hearts. That same idea that we're going to wipe everything clear and start again. So it was very, very enticing. At the same time, a lot of readers say, well, it's a wee bit close to home after COVID, you know, and that moment when I suddenly thought, goodness me, what's going on here? This is frightening.
Yeah, I could see that. I can see how, again, books are often so, readers are so influenced by the time they read the books in. You know, if this had been 5 years ago, then it would have been a very different reaction to reading it now.
Aye, absolutely. It was a strange thing to, you know, at the time that COVID happened, I thought, you know, I've been working on this book. I thought, oh goodness me, you know, I go off to totally start again. And I decided that I was going to make have been a similar pandemic affecting this other society, partly because of you know, I sort of have this Marxist idea that there's a determinism to society, and that things that are sort of technologically related, they will tend to happen regardless of the wee differences in what people do. Mm-hmm. But partly it seemed like it was so important to the ideas of the book that it had to go in. Looking back on it, you know, already you can't say COVID's gone away, but it's not dominating people's world the way that it was. We live in a world where things move very quickly.
Oh no, absolutely. But the book kind of suggests that to get to, you know, the kind of potential at the end of your book, that a kind of reset, a drastic reset is needed. Is that the kind of thing that you think is the case?
I think that just now we've got ourselves into a position where we can't imagine any alternative to endless economic growth.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not wishing a catastrophe upon the world. You know, that would be terrible. And in reality, we all the best will of people, I don't think we're really going to go out and dig up the land and sort ourselves out. But it's an idea. It's a metaphor for making some radical change, not just trying to invent better and better technology that can offset what we're doing while allowing us to continue economic growth, but maybe to think, do we need more economic growth? You know, you think back to what things were like in the 1950s, and the increase in wealth between the 1930s and the 1950s. And I think you went back to people in the 1950s and you told them, well, GDP is going to go up, whatever it is, 15-fold or whatever, from where you are now. When, you know, you had full employment and a big house and things and free education, all the rest of it. And I said, it's going to be this much richer in material terms, but we're just not going to be able to afford our health service. We're not going to be able to afford our pensions. We're not going to be able to afford all sorts of things. I think they just said, that doesn't compute.
How did it get to that state? Yeah, no, absolutely. That's what the book certainly made me think about, because in it you've still got these different classes who come together in quite spectacular ways, but the system that they begin to adopt is one of exchanging goods and skills, and you know, that kind of pre-capitalist system, which, you know, certainly does kind of make you think, in that they all realize the need to change. It's a necessary system in the situation they all find themselves in.
Aye, yeah, and that's the thing, you know, can we make a change so long as we can keep this ticking over one way or another? You know, do we need something radical to force us to change? I hope not. You know,
yeah,
I hope it doesn't get to that point.
Well, let's talk about the characters in this, because there's some fantastic characters in the book as well. How to approach this without giving away spoilers? You've got the people in the block of flats and in the chip shop, and how they kind of pull together to begin with. That's really where the book begins, isn't it? That it's the folk who really have nothing that start to kind of pull together.
Aye, absolutely. And I think all the characters they're all very deeply flawed in different ways, and they're all aspects of myself, you know. All my many sort of feelings written into different people. But I think I hope that makes it more rewarding as they sort of have these various journeys of recovery in different senses, and develop as people.
Do you have favorites that you go and you think, oh yeah, I'd like to, because I was talking to a couple of writers recently, and they were saying that when they finish their books, the central character, they've kind of been so attached to them that they kind of miss them. Now, you don't really have a single central character, you've got multiple characters, but are there any that you'd think, oh, I'd like to kind of write about them again?
I didn't kind of enjoyed them. I like Giorgio. He was fun to write, and he appeared briefly in my first novel as a right. Sort of a bad guy. So it was nice to have a wee bit of fun with him. I liked writing the two student druggies. You know, they were a good laugh. We Ava, you know.
Aye, she's great.
I'm awfully sort of fond of her. But it's quite, sometimes writing's quite sort of therapeutic, you know, because these are all my sort of all my flaws and weaknesses, and you get to sort of imagine solutions for them all to an extent. I ended up, you know, there's a story of Gustave Flaubert when he wrote Madame Bovary, and he was getting pestered for a bit of gossip about who Madame Bovary was based on, and right. Who's the real Madame Bovary? Who's this? And eventually he said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. No, it's me. And maybe that's always the way with your characters, that they're different versions of yourself.
Well, that's interesting, because you mentioned Thomas Hobbes earlier on, and there's a character called Hobbes, you know, in the book. And for those that don't know, Hobbes kind of proffered that the natural state of life is it's nasty, brutish, and short. And at the beginning, you can kind of see that, well, this is the way that it could possibly go. And then his other idea of the social contract to kind of save us, that begins to happen within the group as well. Were there non-fictional influences like Hobbes' theories or other philosophies that influenced you?
Well, definitely, like with the Hobbesian thing, I wanted to do you know, Hobbes is writing at the time of the English Civil War, and there's amazing things going on at that time. Like you've got the levelers and the ranters, and you've got Gerard Winstanley and his diggers. These are folk that took the common land, you know, unplanted land, and tried to harvest it, and were really progressive in terms of their ideas of equality for women and all this. And I've always had a beef with Hobbes, with that idea that without government we're necessarily going to be in this state of savagery. So I wanted to sort of satirize that, and satirize the the survivalist and prepper mentality, which is often based around a sort of obsessive macho thing, and all these people seem to be want, you know, the end of the world. They can't wait for it, and they've got their guns prepared and all this.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have a wee bit of fun with imagining people going full out with the idea of how an apocalypse plays out in the movie, but in a town that in many ways stays fairly normal, where people acting fairly reasonably. So that was a non-fiction influence. The other non-fiction influence that is important is Rebecca Solnit wrote a book, A Paradise Built in Hell, Extraordinary Communities That Arise During Disaster. And she looks at real world responses to various disasters. It's mostly American stuff, but I think the most recent one she looks at is Hurricane Katrina. And she contrasts the popular perception of what's going on with, like, I don't know if you remember, but all the stories about gangs that were murdering and looting and all this, and people just believed that because that's what they expected. And then when the real stories came out, actually people were going around helping each other, and she argues that it's mainly the state response that introduces violence to the situation, and that generally popular responses to disaster are characterized by cooperation and mutual aid.
I don't know if you've seen the film Flint that came out a couple of years ago, but it's about the community in North America, Flint, Michigan, which had its water basically poisoned. They weren't allowed to use certain water, and it's a similar thing. The myths that came out of it compared to what was actually happening, with people absolutely coming together to try and fight government, fight the situation. These people were having to wash themselves and their kids in bottled water because the water was so, you know, poisoned that they couldn't do it. It's a fantastic film to see, but it's exactly that type of thing. How it's spun nationally compared to what the reality is often very, very different. And at the beginning of Disneyland, you can see that change. At the beginning, you kind of touch on the fears that many people may have, that you would have wandering gangs, you know, kind of with nobody to look, no homes to go to, or no times to get to their beds and all that kind of stuff. You've got these survivalists who suddenly, you know, rub their hands together going, I've been waiting for this all my life. All of those things are there. But then quite slowly, I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, but people begin to realize how much they need each other, and suggesting that really small community rather than kind of any big government is where you're going to find these things working at their best.
I think so, you know. Maybe I'm naive, but I think that certainly in small scale interactions, my experience is that people are generally very decent, you know. Not exclusively, of course, you know, people do terrible things, but there's something about having a young child, the kindness people show to you.
Yeah.
The selflessness with which people will often act. So I do have a degree of faith in potential. I wouldn't say that I think that, you know, that human nature is good, because I think we're the only nature about humans is our inherent sociality. You know, we're born unable to look after ourselves. We have to be in communities to survive. But the notion that we are necessarily egoistic, I didn't think there's very much evidence for that.
No, I would agree. We had family illness recently and found exactly the same thing, that, you know, the support and the kindness shown was just incredible. And I agree with you. Again, maybe we're both being naive, but that's what I find as well. And I kind of think that's how I'd rather view the world, rather than thinking everyone's going to do you over.
Aye.
The only slight worry I have about Disneyland is at one point it kind of suggests that Robbie Williams' Angels could become a national anthem.
That's a good tune.
No, you know, to be fair, I'm being musically snobbish. It is a good tune. You're absolutely right. It's a sing-along tune anyway.
I was thinking when we got to that bit, and it's funny, you know, you start thinking about, well, how do people play music these days? Nobody's got I mean, I got all my CDs are up in the loft, like, you know, it's all your Spotify. So if your internet went down, what would you be playing? And I had this idea that, you know, she'd dig out this old battery operated CD player and it'd be whatever was in it for the last time. And of course, Angels, it's again that sort of religious theme that
Yeah.
the book's
No,
interested
no,
in.
absolutely. But it tickled me because I thought, yeah, I can see a full, you know, Hampden Park or something singing along to that if they got going, definitely.
God save us all.
So can you tell us a little bit about your life as a writer? Because you've been doing it for a while, as you suggested.
I have. I started writing and then I got a job for teaching writing, which is a great way to kill your writing. And also to kill your reading to an extent, in that if your day job is reading people's work all day, you're less inclined to come home and read a novel. So sort of reading for pleasure. And some of the stuff that our students do is fantastic and very pleasurable to read. But I did stop reading, you know, the sort of volume that I used to. But this is now my fourth novel. They're all very different. The first one's a sort of a coming of age story. Like a lot of first novels, it's very autobiographical. It's a coming of age story about a young Scottish fellow who works in a burger bar, kind of like I used to, and all that sort of thing. He gets mixed up with the anti-capitalist movement set sort of the end of the 90s. And then I wrote one which was my PhD. It's called The Deconstruction of Professor Throb, and it's I wanted to write. The PhD was a chance to write something that wasn't necessarily for commercial publication, right. And it's quite, I suppose, it's quite a difficult book, and it's quite theoretical. I was really interested in the question of free will and determinism. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I've always tried to explore in my fiction. And it's narrated by a very pompous PhD student. It's a PhD about a PhD, and it's got all that sort of metafictional business going on. And then after that, I tried to write something that's a much more of a straightforward sort of psychological thriller. And then there's been nearly a 10-year gap. So I'm really, really happy to get this book out in the world. And it's lovely that people are being nice about it. You know, you didn't know how it's going to be received. Yeah. And everybody, in fact, it's a bit of a problem for me because I've got a massive chip on my shoulder. So when you start getting nice reviews, it's like, well, maybe they're not all out to get me.
Well, exactly. You have to change things. Well, I just think not only is it a really well-written book, but it is a very timely book. It really will kind of strike a chord with people, whether you meant it or not, at the time that they read it. You know, very timely indeed.
I hope so. I hope so. And I hope it's a book that makes people feel a bit better. You know, like we do live in quite frightening times, and there's an awful lot in our culture that encourages us to be afraid of each other. Yeah. And I hope the book, in some small way, can make us feel a wee bit closer.
And I think, you know, when I started reading it, not really knowing what to expect, you kind of get, oh, well, good, this is quite frightening because some horrible things happen, and, you know, horrible things have to happen. And then, as I'm not giving anything away by saying we've talked about it, people begin to work together. It absolutely does lift your spirits, and you think, yeah, whatever, even in the worst of times, Thomas Hobbes, even in the worst of times, it isn't that bad.
I mean, it's quite hard to do because I was reading Kim Stanley Robinson saying that novels are about what goes wrong, and so it's really difficult to write a utopian novel, or it's boring. You know, everybody's just sort of I mentioned Lord of the Flies earlier on. Imagine if the plot was they all landed on the island and just collected fruit and played games for a few weeks, and then someone picked them up. You know,
they all got on well together, supported each other, and then went home. That's not really it. You're right. You're absolutely right.
No, couple meet and fall in love. That's not a story. Couple meet and fall in love, but their families hate each other. That's a story. Couple meet and fall in love. She's already married. That's a story. You know, there has to be a problem. So a lot of the novel is, it is what you'd expect of a disaster novel. It is about competition for resources. It's about old rivalries and violence and what have you. But there is that turning point.
And again, this may be, if you don't want to give away kind of any secrets here, but you've got an afterword at the end, which made me think, because it alludes that some of the characters may be real people in the real world. Was that something that you're just kind of playing us with, or was it something that you actually went to say, did people exist? Are there people like this in the real world?
It's a wee bit of both, but I wouldn't like to say, because they wouldn't recognize each other themselves and probably wouldn't want to.
But it really fits with everything else right from the beginning, from you saying, hearing the voice and all this, to this kind of going, how much of that was real? Is there any of it real? Which is a really nice kind of twist at the end.
Thank you.
Can you tell us what's next for you? Or is it just all about Disneyland at the moment?
It's just all about Disneyland, and most of my time, I'm mainly a stay-at-home dad just now, so I'm just with my wee boy. Incidentally, he's a huge influence on the book, right? And just the experience of becoming a father, like the language it's written in is sort of influenced by Scots. There's Scottish phrases, and part of that comes from teaching in words, and you've got a decision to make, right? And normally I just use whatever is the word that somebody's expecting to hear. So most of the time, I don't know what I'd say it's your ears, because that's what people, would be expecting to hear. But then when it's somebody who's never heard the word, well, what do you go for? So I found myself saying to him, "Oh, those are your lugs," and it sort of surprised me a bit that the language that the book started to come out in.
Yeah, because it's got, as you say, it's got kind of Scots phrases throughout, but I would say still mainly kind of English in terms of it being written, and that's interesting to hear that you're where you are and who you're with your son, that you're thinking about that way. How do I communicate? It's a simple kind of communication. Oh, and you communicate it very well because it's very kind of easy to read in that way. But yeah, that's interesting in itself, that kind of dislocation you're saying, being away from Scotland for so long. You probably have to think about it more than maybe other writers do.
Absolutely. It's another thing that I noticed, that we'll often be out in the park and we'll get talking to strangers, and now and again we'll get talking to somebody that's also originally from Scotland. There's a lot of people live down here that have been gone a long time, and it's funny, I notice how our voices will change in the course of the conversation. So it's a sort of, "Oh, what a charming little boy, I do like his hat. Why, thank you very much. See, is that a slight Scottish lilt type of text there? It is that. We're from Glasgow ourselves, so is that right?" Before you kind of, you're spraffing away about, and it's nice, it's nice to have some memory of where you come from. And there's sometimes this idea that you'd only use dialect in speech or writing if it's the only way you can express yourself. And that's not necessarily the case at all. It could be that I can do my lecturing voice, and Queen's absolutely fine, but it could be that we like it. And I was listening to his name's gone from my head on the guy who's talking about translating poetry into Chinese.
Oh yeah, yes, right. Brian Holton, I think.
Brian Holton, that's it. Brian Holton, and he was very talking about the Scots language, And he said it had a muscularity, and that struck with me. And I'd also say a rhythm, and it lends itself to humor, and it's just and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Um,
and yeah, it does. I mean, I think we're beyond the point of arguing that it shouldn't be used or it doesn't use. That boat has sailed. It works. We've got so many great writers that write in Scots, write parts in Scots, whatever dialect, however you want to call it. It doesn't really matter what you call it. It's there on the page, and if it works, it works, as with most writing. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to have a chat with me. I really do appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for speaking to me, and thank you so much for reading the book. It's I'm really very grateful.
Well, it's my pleasure, and we'll be back soon with someone completely different.